The Spinosaurus, an original post-apocalyptic story. Part 2 by Peyton Strange, read by the author. Please listen to Part 1 to avoid confusion. Link is in the description. Let's carry on. Throughout the rest of that winter, Spino and I continued to explore. Despite the encounter with the Titanoboa, we felt we still needed to know what other threats might lie outside of our small part of the world. This part of our story tends to blend together, so I'll just condense how things played out until spring came. We found camps with people living together hidden away in the forest, but we never made contact. The power to my house flickered more frequently as the months passed and finally went out for good near the end of winter. I imagine people stopped going to work at the power plants and the grids finally collapsed. According to the battery-powered radio I had at the time, things were still more or less normal in Washington, D.C. The president made daily announcements as the rest of the world rapidly collapsed. The president said the government was focusing on a research project with the CDC to try to create a virus that would wipe out the dinosaurs and all other re-emerged prehistoric animals. But everything they had tried up to that point was just as lethal to humans as it was to dinosaurs. Developing a virus that is lethal to animals from both the Jurassic and Silurian eras, as well as all other time periods, up to the present, is complicated biology, to put it mildly. The virus would have to be lethal to only those animals from prehistoric eras and not lethal to humans or modern animals. This would have been a daunting task for those assigned to the project, and I'm afraid simply impractical as well. My belief is that the virus plan grew out of desperation and not strong science. At least, here, the government didn't take violent measures to try and control what was happening. Other countries with more controlling governments had taken to bombing their own land to purge the threat, their citizens be damned. This horrifying self-destruction took place in countries considered stable and not in some type of conflict already. Countries with ongoing civil wars prior to this event had fallen into even more chaos than they were in before the anomaly. I felt so sad for the people in those places, and I hope most found a way to escape safely. In turn, people who were living in tiny villages or on small isolated islands in, say, the Pacific Ocean were most likely still going about their day-to-day lives without really noticing much of a change. Around this time, I also heard rumors about something weird going on somewhere in Europe, but I never learned anything concrete about that. When the broadcasts from the president finally came to a halt, I believe Washington, D.C. had finally fallen and was no longer able to even try and keep things under control here in the United States. Though I feel security would have taken the president and tucked him in a bunker somewhere by then, so he could provide guidance and control once more when the world came back to normal. I don't see that ever happening, so who knows where he is now. The Tyrannosaurus that saved me from the raptor pack still made occasional appearances around my home, but I never heard him speak. Like I said before, I knew it could speak because I saw that spark of intelligence in his eyes whenever I caught a glimpse of him. It was around this time that I began to see various species of dinosaurs and other prehistoric life much more often. These included various species, some of which I couldn't identify. That Baryonyx family had also grown. The last time I saw them, there were at least a dozen rather cute babies added to the herd. Finally, after spring finally arrived and the trees had all turned green again, I told Spino that the area was becoming simply too dangerous, and we needed to leave. He didn't protest. He'd been more on edge than ever after the Titanoboa incident from months before. I packed 2 bags. I left a note on the island counter explaining the area was too dangerous to stay in and warned anyone who found the note that they needed to leave as soon as possible. I also left a mention about what direction we had walked in just in case any extended family decided to try and come find me. The least I could do was let them know I was alive. I had cut off all contact with everyone but a cousin from Alabama when I went to college. There was a chance they had survived when things turned bad and might have tried to locate me. I still don't know if they survived the initial collapse, but I hope they did. This wasn't like an apocalyptic movie where a virus wiped out 99% of the population. In our new world, most of the world's population had survived. People scattered from the cities and into the countryside or onto boats on the ocean when things got bad. The majority of those who died when things fell apart probably did so in the cities, during the chaos of the collapse as people fought one another for supplies. At least that's the image I gathered from what was happening around here in the US. It might have played out completely differently in other countries, I have no way of knowing. Just before I left my house for the last time with Spino, we had a surprise visitor. It was the Tyrannosaurus Rex who saved me from the raptors. He didn't speak, he just stood in the tree line and looked at us. After a while, he nodded his head at me in such a way that I understood meant to be a goodbye and a wish for good luck. When we came to the first highway, I honestly wasn't sure what to expect. Roaming groups of people had to be everywhere, and these expansive roads would likely be one of their top choices for travel. When we came to the highway, a large divided one with 4 lanes, it was empty, save for abandoned cars scattered all around. Surrounding us were tall, forested hills and doubtless unseen threats. I think that seeing the abandoned cars everywhere brought on the true realization that the civilized world really had ended or was on the cusp of totally falling apart. It hit me like a truck that had been flung off the road by a triceratops. I was emerging from roughly half a year in isolation to a whole new world. Reading about the collapse online and hearing about it on the radio still had a feeling of disconnect from it all. Seeing it with my own eyes is what made it real. Our trek down the highway, which wound through forests and hills and occasionally past silent towns, lasted for several uneventful days. I thought that maybe if I could find a police car, I could use the radio to figure out where people might have been, but I never could find one. Spino was able to find food for us easily enough, and I'd packed enough water to last about 100 miles if I was careful with the amount I drank. Other than that, I didn't pack much. There was some clothes, some basic medical supplies, a small first aid kit, a small tent and sleeping bag, some other odds and ends, and a few of my favorite books. I also made room to pack the stuffed Dilophosaurus that I had had since I was a kid. It's my equivalent to a teddy bear, and I couldn't just leave it behind. And so, I packed it. Leaving everything else behind forever had been much harder than I thought it would be. You know that before the collapse, scientists were trying to clone a woolly mammoth, right? Well, let me tell you quickly about the time that I first saw a mammoth with my own eyes. It was while I was on the road with Spino. Who would have thought that scientists didn't have to bring the mammoth back, but only had to wait for the universe to do it for them? We made camp off the side of the road, and I'd gotten a nice fire going before it came dark. At that point, I still wasn't used to just how silent and still the world was. Cars, planes, or other human-caused noises. You have no idea how much those noises of all of our machines and technology make until they are just taken away. I often became lost in thought while thinking about it, what was happening to everyone on the planet, and would just end up staring into the fire for hours on end, just like this particular night. To me, it seemed that my fire was the only light left shining on Earth. Are you okay? Spino asked me after a while. I'm I'm just I don't know. Not doing well with everything, I replied, looking at him. Everyone I know is probably dead. Everything I know is gone. Is there even any point of going on? Seeing the world abandoned through my own eyes had been harder to take than I'd expected. Hearing about it happening through the grapevine using only my ears and my imagination made it seem less real. It was when the protection of my home was gone that I finally had to face the ugly reality of what the world had become. And facing that reality was tough enough that it caused me to have a serious spike in depression in that moment of clarity. There's always a reason, Spino said in return. Maybe you just don't know what it is yet. Maybe, I replied, nodding slightly. A distant roar sounded in the night, and both of us looked in the direction it seemed to come. You're not alone. At the very least, I'm still here with you, Spino told me, still looking in the direction the roar had come from. Thanks, buddy, he said. The truth was, Spino did make me feel better. He was my constant guardian angel on those desolate roads, forests, and anywhere else that I needed him. His caring presence was enough for me to shed off that depressive state. It was as I was thinking about this when I saw something cross the empty highway in the distance. Spino and I were witness to the sight of an actual woolly mammoth crossing the road. We watched it exit the trees on the right, cross the road until it vanished on the left, trumpeting one time as it moved on. I was entranced. I think most people would have been if they got to see what their ancestors thousands of years ago saw. It was like seeing something else mythical, something you should never have been able to actually see, the flesh. After following the road for several uneventful days, I recall sitting alongside of the road, resting during a hot afternoon, when I heard a truck engine. This was the first artificial sound I had heard since I left my house. The truck stopped a short distance down the road from where we were, and we could see people begin to set up tents. I crept closer, with Spino right behind me. He was practically crawling on his stomach, pressed tightly down on the ground to keep as low as possible. It was somewhat comical looking, honestly. From where we lay, hidden among the weeds, we heard people from the truck talking to a young woman. She was thanking them for saving her. After I listened in on their conversation for a while, I decided that they seemed like good people. I told Spino not to come out until I said, then I walked out and asked loudly if there was an open invitation to be saved by the group. I remember how much they jumped at my appearance and how the act made them appear to be suddenly very on edge. They seemed a little too on edge. I introduced myself and told them I hadn't seen anyone new in nearly a year, and we talked about whether I could go with them or not. After prodding me with questions until they seemed satisfied with my answers, they said I had to pull my weight if I joined them. I grinned at that statement and I said to them that my buddy could pull more than our weight combined. All of our weight combined, actually. They chuckled at this and asked who my buddy was. After telling them not to freak out, I turned and called, "Come out!" Spino slowly came out of the trees, and there was a collective gasp, and they raised their guns, taking aim. "I told you not to freak out!" I laughed, and then explained that Spino was my friend. They were quite nervous, but lowered their guns. I still chuckle at that memory whenever I think about it. "How?" one of them finally managed to say. Then I told them about how I found the egg and raised the baby that hatched from it. They were still doubtful about Spino, but agreed that we could go back to their community with them. A whole community. I found that exciting. I hadn't seen a functioning community since before society's fall. They continued to be on edge for Spino for a few hours afterwards, but I think they warmed up to him just a little more when he brought back an entire deer for us to share for supper. After we ate and talked a while longer, they explained that they were scouts for their community, and their job was to locate other survivors. They also told me that they were having an ongoing conflict with another group who seemingly forced dinosaurs into submission and then used them by riding them into battle. They told me that this dinosaur riding group were really bad people, which was why they were so jumpy when I appeared. They then added that they also were trying to kill all of them, but neither side had gotten an advantage over the other in the months that the conflict had dragged on. They'd been sent out a few days prior to our meeting by their community's leader to scavenge for supplies and find any other people who were not affiliated with their enemy and who needed a home. It was a job they'd been doing for months by that time, and they had been doing it over again every few weeks like clockwork. So, now that we've covered up to my basic introduction to the community I still call home today, this next part of my story is how I found myself in the middle of a war to save it. It seems that even when the world falls apart around us, humans can still not find a way to work together and get along. I guess some things never change. And I find it amazing that humans ever got as far along as we did building our civilizations throughout our collective history with this in mind. Before describing my part in the war, I'm going to describe what the community is like, or was like at the time of my arrival. Before the world ended, the place had been a housing development. Newly constructed one, in fact. So recently built before things fell apart that none of the houses had been lived in yet. That meant nice new houses, newly paved streets, lots of room, a park like area at the center of the community, and even basic self sustaining systems. They still had running water and basic electricity thanks to solar panels on each house. But keeping the running water system working properly did end up becoming an issue, and we had to shut the system off after about a year. Until we can find a natural spring to tap into and run that water through a reworked pipe system, we're out of running water. But we have wells to draw water from, so it's not a huge issue, just an inconvenience. I quickly learned that their town existed due to pure luck. When civilization was busting at the seams and on the fringe of falling apart completely, many people fled out of the cities and moved into the country, as I had deduced early on. Just before winter, during that time in autumn that the weather gets cold and stays that way, several groups of people came to the town because they knew that its construction had just been completed, partially due to signs advertising this fact out on the highways. They simply used the leftover building materials from the construction to build a wall that surrounded the community. The wall was a giant, roughly square shaped barrier around the community, about as tall as Spino, which allowed the community to remain as it was while the world outside broke down and fell into unprecedented. However, the community members quickly found out that there was a trade off for living in this place. As the area the community had been built in was very heavily forested on all sides, it was easy for others to sneak close to the wall without being seen. In some areas, the trees grew right up against the wall. This lack of visibility was later cited by community members as a reason that the previously mentioned hostile group had been able to catch everyone unawares, even with guards posted on the walls. Trees were simply too densely packed to see anyone approaching. However, cutting down enough trees to remedy that issue was considered unworthy of the limited resources such an action would take. Now that you better understand the community situation, I'm going to get back to my part of the story. This chance felt like a time to begin once more. When Spino and I arrived outside of the gate, those who found us took out a walkie talkie and explained to someone on the other side that they had three newcomers and not to worry because the dinosaur was with them and was tame and could talk. At this point, I could see the wall. Outwardly, it was covered in sheets of various metals. These sheets of mostly steel covered the original wooden wall that had been constructed, and it had been put up to further increase defensive ability. Out of all the walls that surround the community, the wall in front of us was the only one with a gate. When the gate was pulled open for us, I saw it slide open on a track instead of swinging as I had thought it would. Once we were inside, I noticed a series of walkways along the perimeter that guards would walk along to keep watch, accessible by ladders. We made our way further inside. Spino drew a bit of a crowd of onlookers. Back then, talking animals were still an alien concept for most, but he was quickly explained to everyone. Most people still kept their distance, though. I remember what happened next clearly, so I can describe it in great detail. A young African American man stepped out of the crowd. He was around the same age as me and walked right up to me, looked me in the eyes, and shook my hand and introduced himself. Hi, name's Mark, he said, slight accent to his voice. This was a man who would not only become a friend, but who I would come to view as the brother I never had. Mark was a man with kind eyes, slightly muscular build, and a protruding bottom jaw forming an underbite. Being polite, I shook his head in return and smiled. It's nice to meet you. I always come to meet the new people. Those same scouts found me out on the road. I'd been on the road for a while by the time they found me. I came from this big ranch house in Montana. I grew up there, but I left back in January and was trying to get to Washington, Mark explained. I remember saying, wow, you came from a long way, my eyebrows raising in surprise. Yeah, it was a long trip. I went east until I hit Lake Michigan. Then I swung southeast until I came to the Indiana Dunes Lakeshore, just outside of Chesterton, Indiana. Beautiful place where I thought about just staying, since there was a colony of people already there. After I left there, I headed south for a while, then I headed east again just north of Indianapolis. Lots of bad people out there, and a lot of dangerous animals too. But I made it, and this place has been so nice that I'm happy I didn't reach Washington. Where'd you come from? He asked. I shrugged. Nowhere special, just down the road away, I guess. As I was speaking, a Caucasian man wearing a light tan jacket pushed through the crowd. He was older than me, in his 70s, I later learned. He was paler than me, too. Had a gruff demeanor, had wrinkles and white hair, and an aura of authoritative control. And while he was trying to be polite, I could tell I wasn't going to like him. I could tell that the moment I saw this guy, that he was an ass. He introduced himself as Wheatley and then said, I'm the man in charge of this community, and the one who okayed your large friend. But if there is any problem with him, you're both out. You understand me, sport? Yeah, and it's Nick, not sport, I said to him. Wheatley chuckled. Okay, Tiger. Then he went to introduce himself to the new girl who was in our group. I think her name was Sarah. I didn't know her long, so I don't remember for sure. Wheatley then showed us to our new homes. We stopped at mine first. It was a nice place, one that I would never have been able to afford in the old world. Before I went inside, I walked around the back of the house. The backyard was more than large enough for Spino to sleep and stretch out in comfortably. After making that determination, I stepped inside the back door, set my bag down on the kitchen table, and on the table lay a newspaper from a few months back. The front page story was about living dinosaurs being found. I found this a little humorous, but decided to explore the house instead of reading it. Our home was on a more isolated street in town, with inside of the gate, and both the houses on either side of us were empty. I was alright with that. I think Spino was too, and I think they did it so Spino would be separated from everyone else. Spino didn't really like the place. He felt boxed in compared to the freedom he'd had all his life prior, so I tried to comfort him by telling him that he'd get used to us. It was our home now, after all. That night, I ate supper while sitting in my new living room. I had been told that Spino would just have to tell the gate guards when he wanted to go hunting or leave the community for any reason, and they'd let him out and back in upon his return. While I was eating, he was snoozing out in the backyard without having gone and eaten anything at all. I think he just wanted to stay close to me in case this place was some kind of giant setup. The way Spino looked at Wheatley revealed that he didn't trust him or like him at all. I don't think Wheatley was all that bad of a guy, but felt he was a controlling man with little regard for others. I felt that Wheatley did appreciate having such an asset as Spino in his community, though. Spino thought we'd be better off if he simply ate Wheatley and put an end to the whole irritation. But Spino knew better than to try it. I told him that in exchange for a safe place to live, he could put up with a little irritation from the guy in charge. My first evening was nice. It was heavenly, not having to look over my shoulder to make sure we weren't being trailed. Being eaten alive in my own home had made me a little paranoid, so the change was welcome. I remember being surprised when there was a knock at the door. I'd finished eating and was washing my plate. I dried my hands and went to the door, and Mark was standing there. Thought I'd come by, get to know you a little bit. Okay, come in, I replied to him, smiling. He came inside, and I shut the door behind him. Mark sat down on the leather couch, and I took the matching recliner. After offering him a drink, which he refused, we made inquisitive chit-chat. As we talked, I realized that Mark didn't seem to be the quickest person at picking up certain social cues. He often spoke in long, unbroken monologues without pausing. I quickly learned, also, that he was a man who enjoyed the sound of his own voice, and I found it hard at times to get a word in. However, I also learned that he had a heart of pure gold, as a very hopeful outlook on everything. So I greatly enjoyed his company and the stories he told me about his family and his life in Montana. He was just as interested in my time raising Spino. Some of our conversation went like this. So, where do you come from exactly? He asked me. I could tell he wanted specifics this time, so I told him about my old house, how I'd raised Spino there, and that I had walked all the way here with Spino. probably less than 50 miles. I asked Mark about himself, and he said he'd wanted to join the military back in his teens, but the recruiter had told him to leave, saying something about his poor vision being a danger to everyone. His mother had been heartbroken by this. My vision's not the best, he admitted to me, tapping his glasses. But I see just fine with these. I think that officer was just... He trailed off, so I offered up a suggestion. An ass? I said, finishing the sentence with an understanding look. Mark smiled and chuckled. That works, he nodded in an approving manner. I am a terrific shot, and could have been the best sniper the US military ever saw for all that guy knew. But instead, I committed myself to taking care of the family ranch, which has been passed down from father to child since the Civil War. My granddaddy's granddaddy fought in that war, helped storm a Confederate fort on some beach even. Family story is that he shot some Confederate general and then threw him over the wall. There's a picture of him back at the ranch. He was a big man, so it might be true. I hope that I can go back to that ranch one day. Whole family is buried there, and I want to be too, if possible. We talked for several more minutes until Mark said he had to leave. It was getting late, and he rose early in the mornings. I wished him a good night, and after he left, I went out to the backyard. Spino playfully pounced on me from the side as soon as I was out the door, pinning me down under one of his large hands, and he said, "Just because we're somewhere new doesn't mean old games are going to stop." Let me up, and I groaned. Being pinned, even relatively gently, by a Spinosaurus doesn't feel good. Remember that if you ever befriend one. They play roughly. I told him that I was fine with that, though he needed to remember he wasn't exactly small anymore. He seemed happy to hear that I was okay with old games continuing as they used to, though I don't think my advisory statement made any difference. I was just pleased that he seemed to be warming up to the community. He laid down in the yard, and I joined him. Instead of sleeping in my new bed on my first night, I spent it snuggled with my giant best friend, safe as could be. That first day was nice. It really was. As I pointed out, I didn't have to continuously look over my shoulder, and I could relax for the first time in months. Do you appreciate how much stress builds up in that amount of time? Finally letting it release was heavenly. That all came to an end on the second day. That was the day I realized just how bad the conflict really was. The morning had begun well. I took a shower and shaved for the first time in almost a year. When I went outside, Wheatley was walking up to the door. My bliss came to an end pretty much right away from there. "Oh, good morning," he said with a smile that made me suspicious. "Want to come in? I just started coffee," I offered him. "That would be great. Thank you." I poured 2 cups. He requested no sugar in his. Then I waited for what he had to say. It didn't take long. He spilled the beans right away. "I'm sure you've heard about our little issue with the group we call the Dinosaur Riders, though most people simply refer to them as Dino Riders for short. It is just a nickname, mind you. We don't know what they call themselves. They're bandits, marauders, murderers. My guess is that they're all the kind of people who were just waiting for a world without government-enforced laws and regulations to hold them back from their true desires. You and your giant friend are joining the fight against them. Consider it the price of admission." He then took a sip from his drink and waited for my reply. I couldn't argue, and just told him to go on and listen to what he had to say. As it turned out, the Dino Riders were a group who had shown up seemingly from out of nowhere, riding Utah raptors with slightly altered horse saddles. Those raptors they rode were smart dinosaurs, so the community's best guess was that they had been trained like people who trained horses or dogs for combat. Some of the raptors could be the talking kind for all we knew. The riders themselves were a deviously clever bunch, often coming up with new ways of carrying out attacks. They also seemed like they were nothing more than traveling raiders that just hit any community or group they happened to find. With the number of riders in the group and how well stocked they were, Wheatley knew that there had to be a camp or other base of operations set up nearby. They must have been stocked from earlier successful attacks and raids on other groups. Turns out this prediction was correct. That very morning, some of the community's scouts found the Dino Riders camped in a large field not far from the town. An attack was going to be carried out against the Riders later that day. My first day in the conflict played out like this. I was given a gun, and 2 hours later, riding on Spino's back, we left with nearly half the community. They were all in trucks or cars, and after a while of creeping along the empty roadways, we stopped. Everyone left the vehicles and moved to a hill just off the road. The mission was simple. Get to a high point above the Dino Riders' camp and attack. We wanted to put an end to the fighting. I learned that this conflict had been ongoing since the middle of winter. I knew it had been going on for months, but I didn't realize it had been that extensive. Also, most of the survivors in the community were not experienced or trained and had been forced to learn as they fought. Combine their lack of training with the new snow that had fallen over the winter, and it had been a very brutal few months for everyone involved. When I was told, the populace of the community was much smaller when I joined than it had been. When we made our way to our point of attack, I considered what was about to happen. I never thought that I'd be forced to point a gun at someone with the intention to kill. I was trying to mentally prepare myself to pull that trigger, to murder someone, not to kill. When we neared our destination, Spino dropped down onto his belly so I could slide off his neck and join the rest of the makeshift militia. We all crouched, walked, or crawled toward the top of the hill that we would use to ambush our enemies. Spino stayed back so he could not be seen. He was a wild card we could play if things got messy. We all went to the top of the hill and crouched down, just off the side of the road, and hit the signal to attack. Just as we were about to stand up and start firing, several strangers jumped out in front of the tall grass in front of us and stabbed several of our people with spears. We opened fire on them, shooting several people as they emerged from the tall grass. I froze, just like that time I'd first encountered a tyrannosaur, when the skirmish began and didn't shoot once. By the time those who'd ambushed us were lying dead on the ground, the riders down in the camp had jumped up onto the backs of their raptors and began riding up the hill towards us, screaming war cries. After everything I'd been told, I thought their numbers seemed rather small, but I couldn't focus on that at the moment. They had guns too, and overall, they seemed rather well stocked, so I believed Wheatley's guess that they had raided and stolen from other smaller groups of survivors. I also would bet that they fed their victims to their dinosaurs. They had to have some way of controlling those massive Utah raptors after all. I cannot be certain that this assumption is correct, but it was probable. It seems impossible they could easily feed a whole cavalry of Utah raptors without resorting to some mass production of meat. People are resourceful, and the Dino Riders clearly had found a way to deal with the issue of feeding their steeds. The raptors were coming at us in a fast blur of claws and feathers, and we moved back down toward the cars for cover. Some of the riders with bows began shooting flaming arrows at us as we backed off. Others were using what were clearly poisoned arrows, while others were also firing normal, unaltered ones at us. It didn't really matter what type of arrow they used, though. Each one could kill you. I knew that once the riders with guns got to the top of the hill, the place would become a shooting gallery. It was at this time that I raised my weapon with shaking hands. This time, I'd mentally prepped myself enough that I knew I could shoot to kill. The riders only stopped their charge once they reached the top of the hill. It was at this time that Spino revealed himself and roared. Terrified at the sudden appearance of a giant carnivore, the riders scampered in all directions. Seeing them scatter was a great relief. If Spino hadn't been there, most of us, if not all of us, probably would have been killed. The Dino Riders had clearly been ready for us, so they must have known we were coming. Maybe their own scouts had seen us? It didn't matter. That day, we were saved by our Spinosaurus friend. But damn, the riders were slippery. While we were tending to the wounded, our handheld radios broke out in a mix of voices and static. We quickly picked up on what was being said, and it was the worst thing we could have heard. The Dino Riders were attacking our home. and most of the community's fighting force was outside of our walls. It turns out, several riders had climbed up the walls like actual monkeys, overpowered the guards on the wall, and pulled the gate open just enough for the Utah Raptors to start slipping inside. The other riders outside then appeared from the forest, pulled the gate open fully, and attacked. It was the first time they'd gotten inside of the walls of the community. Whenever we heard about it, an intense firefight had already broken out on the main street. I just didn't understand how they'd reached the community so quickly. Utah Raptors were fast, but not that fast. But I learned. We all learned. My observation of there being so few of them during our attack had been an omen. They'd been 2 steps ahead of us from the start. We got home quickly and found several houses ablaze and a full-on war raging throughout the town. The most intense fighting was in the area around the gate. Suddenly, the riders from the camp reappeared behind us. They had divided their numbers from the beginning, with the bulk of their forces waiting to attack the community while we were gone. As we returned to our home, over 100 more dino riders charged in from behind us, cutting us off from any escape and trapping us all inside. "Shit! There's more than we thought!" a voice shouted through the radio I was wearing on my waist. I found out later that this was the first time the community had seen the dino riders full force, because they often attack with small groups or deadly ambushes that left no survivors. It seemed that their patience had run out and they decided to attack in full force while our numbers were divided. The ones at the camp hadn't put up a fight at all because they were just a distraction. Spino was our saving grace once again. Even with their numbers, the dino riders, even their raptors, couldn't fight off a massive, oversized Spinosaurus. Throughout the battle, I shot several riders and their dinosaurs. This was an action that only really hit me emotionally once it was over. But the only one of us who really made a difference by the end of it all was Spino. That day, he got his claws very bloody, killing at least 40 dino riders on his own. His teeth, his claws, stepping on them, biting them, and throwing them. He saved us that day. He was enough to finally make the dino riders flee the battle and retreat into the forest. It had been hours of hard fighting, but we'd driven them out. Our dead were many, including Sarah, Wheatley, and dozens more. But we'd saved our home, for the time being. Spino had been an overwhelming opponent, and because of him, their casualties had been higher than ours. The dino riders still outnumbered us, especially if you counted both rider and dinosaur separately. That realization was a daunting one. The only solace was that we had a primal force like Spino on our side, and that we seemed to have better weapons overall than the riders did. Following the battle, we hoped that we would have some time before the next attack to recover and prepare. But it would come that night, and it would be even worse. I ended my last entry without explaining the aftermath of the attack, so I'll dive into that and supply some details about it before covering the next attack the Dino Riders carried out against us. We were able to extinguish the fire started during the battle, but many of the buildings were severely damaged, especially the ones in the vicinity of the gate and around the protective walls. Some could be repaired, but new ones were going to be needed built in. My thoughts throughout that afternoon were on the battle, and I saw images rushing through my head that scared me, things I tried to push away each time. The moment of reflection, the thought came to me of just how easy it had been to turn a gun on another human being. The first man I shot was one who jumped from his raptor and sprinted at me with some kind of handheld weapon. I didn't think about it. I just pulled the trigger and kept firing until he was on the ground. I killed the person, but had not really thought about how easy it had been. When I realized later that it had been so easy, I became really scared. This new world changes you quicker than you realize. What it changed me into was something I did not want to consume. The side of me that still exists, and it scares me, but I have never let it dominate me. Still, throughout the battle, it had been so frighteningly easy to take another's life. In the apocalypse setting, killing is an inevitability. Not allowing that ease to kill to take over your whole being is the hard part. Because if you do allow it, it will change you forever. It will take you to a dark place, and that's somewhere that I never want to go. I had to tell myself that you could still be a good person, even if you had to do bad things at times. For those of you sharing this world with me, you will eventually have to get blood on your hands, if you haven't already. Don't let it define you. You can stay a good person even when you must do the worst things imaginable just to stay alive. Just remember that. Your actions don't define you if you don't let them. During a more placid moment of that afternoon, I decided to have a seat on a bench near my house. It had remained undamaged during the invasion of the riders. I willingly relinquished it for community use due to the number of damaged buildings, and it was being used to house several wounded people temporarily. The community ended up needing it for several weeks because my house ended up being used to hold people who had suffered burns from the fires. As I sat on the bench, I was joined by Mark, who had also survived the attack. He began chatting with me, just like the night before. "You know what I'm gonna do when this is all over?" Mark asked me, having picked up right where he'd left off last night. "What's that?" I responded. "There's this empty lot down at the end of this street. I'm going to build me a little cabin. A little one-room cabin. Something that feels like home. I always wanted one on our land back in Montana. My daddy said that we'd build one, but we never got around to it," he told me, and then continued to describe his exact vision to me down to the last nail. I remember his words and voice as if he'd just told me this yesterday. "I tell you what," I said to him, "when this is over, I'll help you build it." Mark seemed very happy with this news, and he said, "You are the nicest person in this town. Wheatley was never nice to nobody. You're different. Can I call you a friend?" I smiled at that, which turned into a laugh after a few seconds. "Damn right you can," spoke. He then put a hand on my shoulder. "Nick, my good friend," he replied. By the time the sun set, people were trying to fix the gate, but were met with little success. So it was stuck open and would remain so until a few replacement parts could be found. After watching them try to clear away the mess for a while, I found that I needed to just not see it for a while. I needed to get away from the mess and decided to take a few minutes away from everyone and walk with Spino to an unpopulated part of the town. Most of the buildings on that street had been burned to varying extents, but thankfully they were all uninhabited, and thus empty of people. Spino sat down in one of the yards, and I just enjoyed a chance to be alone with him after the horror show of the day. "You know, I could fancy a wink or two," I said to him, putting my gun down on the sidewalk. Spino gave me a gentle nudge with his snout, followed by a giant lick as I sat down next to him before he laid his head down, which I leaned against. I was as restless and tense as I was tired, but gazing into his affection-filled red eye until I fell asleep helped me feel calm and reassured. Honestly, I do not know how long I slept. I hadn't intended to fall asleep in the first place, but I had just been so sore and tired that it had ended up happening. Put it lightly, it had been a bad day. Spino was more worried for me than he was about the town, which is why he didn't stop me from falling asleep. Cheeky dinosaur. When I woke up, it was dark out. It must have been sometime in the middle of the night. The sounds of popping, crashing, shrieking, and screaming from the gate had woke me. The gate was a few streets over from where we were sleeping. Spino then looked down at me and simply said, "They're back." There was already a tense firefight going on when we arrived back to the main area of the town, and I got to experience the ugly horror of war all over again. I tell you, that stuff leaves deep wounds that never heal. Not fully, I was witness to several people from the community getting jumped on, pinned under, and mauled by the large raptors the dinosaur riders used as steeds. War cries and gunshots sounded from everywhere, along with roars from the riders' Utah raptors. The occasional explosion, which left several more buildings on fire. Stray bullets flew over my head before I reached the street where the main battle was happening. I scanned the battlefield once I arrived. The street was illuminated by the red glow from burning buildings, and I saw Mark struggling with someone who had a knife and was straddling him. "Mark!" I shouted, adding my voice to the cacophony filling the night. I raised my gun, but Spino got the guy instead. Swinging his clawed hand down, he sent the dino rider attacking Mark flying into a burning building. I watched the rider crash through the charred roof and fall inside, where the flames consumed him like a baryonyx consumes fish. I hurried to Mark's side and helped him to his feet. "Are you okay?" I asked him. He nodded, adjusting his glasses. "Thank you, both of you." As we joined the fight, I noticed several folks from the community dove into some of the ditches along the side of the road and were using them as cover as they shot at both attacking humans and dinosaurs from a place of relative safety. There must also have been some dino riders outside because a constant barrage of flaming arrows was raining down on us and our buildings from the other side of the wall. Occasionally, a flaming bundle would fly over the wall and explode when it landed. Maybe that's why there were so many Utah raptors that didn't appear to have riders at the time. I picked my target, a group of Utah raptors just milling around, and started shooting them. One of the dinosaurs had a rider on its back, and he jumped off as my bullet killed the raptor. The rider threw an actual grenade at me as I shot him. It landed a few feet from me, but thinking fast, I whacked it with the butt end of my gun, and it flew into another crowd of the attackers. There was at least 10 riders taken out by the explosion. All casualties were humans, as there were no dinosaurs among the group. As I hurried to cross the street, I spotted both human and dinosaur marauders attacking the building that served as a makeshift treatment center housing the most critically wounded from previous attacks. Several people, who volunteered to work as nurses, were standing outside, armed with automatic weapons, and were defending the entrance. Their bravery was to be commended, but sadly it was all in vain. A dino rider threw another grenade that went crashing through one of the building's windows. I watched the guards go inside to rescue whomever they could in the few seconds they had, but no one ever came out. I raised my gun to fire at the dino rider who had thrown the grenade. My gun clicked. "Oh shit!" I remember saying as I realized I'd never put a fresh clip in after the last attack ended. I didn't have time to think of something brilliant though, because a large man holding an axe charged at me. I dropped my gun and picked up a long section of metal pipe that was laying close by, likely thrown out of a building by an explosion. I ducked when the man swung for my head, and then I swung my pipe upward, striking the man in the chin and making him tumble back. Spino had seen what was happening and got behind the rider as I swung again. The man tumbled backward, landing in Spino's open jaws. Spino slammed his massive jaws shut, and I could hear the crunch of the dino rider's body as Spino crushing him. By now, most of the buildings in the immediate area were on fire, but most of our people didn't panic. With Spino's help, I managed to rally our people into a defensive wall that began forcing the dino riders back. The buildings on the street that weren't on fire were being heavily defended by several of our people, who'd ran inside them and began shooting at the dino riders from out of open second-story windows. These buildings also offered safe places to take the wounded. Many had been hurt. I vividly remember the grisly wounds left on those who had survived being mauled by the Utah raptors. I couldn't stand to look at them, and visualizing them now makes me feel ill. How we pulled it off, I still don't understand. It was honestly... I was so into the moment that I don't remember all of it. But as a rallied force, we pushed the dino riders into a second retreat and secured the town again. It almost felt like divine intervention. We won the fight, but we all knew that unless something changed, we'd be in the same situation again. And after everything that had happened, our ship was close to sinking. We knew that one more attack would be enough to ruin us. We had to be the ones to make a decisive blow, but we needed more people to do it. As much as Spino proved to be a near unstoppable force in battle, he wasn't enough by himself. Thankfully, it turned out others were thinking like I was and knew we needed to find some new allies to help us defeat the raiders. I'll skip the details of that night of treating the wounded, because it was so gory that I'd rather forget it entirely. When the sun came up, I was exhausted, soaked in drying blood, and apparently, I laid down on the grass and passed out from exhaustion. Spino says he took me to the same isolated area that I had napped earlier so he could watch over me until I woke up. He wanted me to have a proper rest despite what anyone else might have thought about it. He's sweet for a Spinosaurus. No? I woke up, cradled in his claws, that afternoon, more mentally worn out than I'd ever been before in my life. After a while of laying there on the earth's floor, sore and still exhausted despite sleeping most of the day away, I knew that I had to help out the short-handed community. So I stretched and went to join the cleanup of the charred rubble. After the multiple attacks, at least half the buildings and homes were burned beyond any hope of repair, and they'd have to be torn down and built anew. Obviously, that wasn't something that could happen at all until the conflict was over, and that same afternoon, we held a town meeting in the small park to discuss how our new beginning could be brought about. The atmosphere from the people in that meeting is something I will never forget. There was a feeling of loss, despair, acceptance of defeat, yet a twinge of defiance lingered. There was an undertone of determination. We all wanted to overcome the horrors we had all seen. Those feelings took root in my mind and others. When someone shared the idea of sending some people out to look for another group, an established group that could help us, I instantly volunteered to do it. Mark jumped up and announced he'd come with me. Of course, Spino declared he wasn't going to let me go out there on my own. After the meeting ended, we were given what supplies could be spared: food, water, guns, and ammunition. We left shortly after that, accepting the well wishes of all those who stayed behind. After walking at a quick pace for most of the day, we set up a temporary camp as the sun finally began to set. Spino went off by himself and later returned with, no surprise, a deer. We happily butchered it, roasted it, and ate well. Eventually, Mark and I went into our own tents. It was too dangerous to sleep under the stars given the circumstances, because anywhere with the dinosaurs around was already dangerous. We chose the safest place to sleep we could, away from the road, where it would be hard to see us. Spino wrapped himself around our tents, supplying a wall of protection, and he watched over us throughout the night. I remember the wonderful moment that we finally found what we were looking for. It happened right around midday. A community of people had set themselves up in what was once a pioneer village. Like our community, they also built a wall around themselves. Their wall was completely made of wood and not layered over with steel, and their gates swung open instead of sliding on a track like ours did. They had guards posted along the walls, and when we told them that we were from a nearby community and we had a proposal to form an alliance, they let us inside, took our guns, and escorted us to the man in charge. That man, Arnold, is still in charge today. He was a very no-nonsense, down-to-earth kind of fella, with a rather wonderful daughter. We told him everything, and if we were successful, we'd split the spoils of war between our communities 50-50. He agreed to help us for one reason. It turned out that they, too, were fighting the Dino Riders, and he felt that as a united group, we could defeat them. We stayed as their guests while they prepared their militia for a fight. Like us, their militia was a ragtag group. 2 mornings later, Mark, Spino, and I returned to our community with a surplus of fresh supplies and an even larger number of fresh fighters. Shortly after returning, I was filled in on what we had missed while scouting. There had been a few skirmishes with the Dino Riders, but no further large battles. Why the Dino Riders had scaled back their attacks, no one knew for certain, but many believed that they were likely scavenging supplies, preparing to attack again. Our scouts also found the true location of the Dino Riders' camp. It turned out that the camp we attacked earlier was either a smaller camp set up away from the main one, or, more likely, I think, nothing but a decoy camp. Thinking about it now, I think it probably was exactly that. Especially because they hadn't even remotely tried to conceal it. Their true camp was placed in the center of a very large field surrounded by trees. Because of the trees, no one could see the camp, and it had remained hidden. Now that we had joined with another group, we also realized that we now outnumbered the Dino Riders, though their numbers remained larger if you counted both Human Rider and their Utah Raptor as separate entities. But with the realization, we planned to use overwhelming force combined with the element of surprise to sweep them away. It could work if we pulled it off right. Though pulling that if off was much easier to do in theory than it was in reality. As we were leaving the community, and to calm himself, Mark started explaining more details about his cabin to me. I got it all planned out. You see, I'll get the lumber from the woods just outside of town. We got a spot marked to turn into a logging camp. Okay? Then, I'll build the walls once I get it all sawed up. I want the whole log cabin package. Dirt floor, straw bed, fireplace for cooking and warmth, built from the ground up with good old-fashioned saws, hammers, and nails. There also is enough unused brick in the community just lying against one of the walls that I can use for a nice chimney, he described. It'll be really nice, I replied. The image described depicted a rosy little cabin that anyone could see as homely. He continued on, and you'd be welcome anytime. We could chat or play cards. I like games like Hand and Foot, 3 a.m., poker, Texas Hold'em, if you know it, Rat Slap, Blackjack, Crazy Eights, any card game, really. He seemed to realize that he was beginning to ramble and caught himself with a chuckle. Then he carried on. I can also make us dinner. I make a real mean gumbo. My aunt taught me how to make it. She learned of this old local recipe while living on the Gulf Coast of Florida. Might need to use crayfish as a substitute for a few ingredients, but I could make it work. I also have a great stew recipe, one that I came up with myself. Mark was certainly a man who liked talking. He was terrific, but often gave too many details. I was okay with that, since he was such a positive man to talk with. And I loved that someone was already looking toward a future with no conflicts with the dinosaur riders. Even in the midst of an apocalypse, Mark thought of card games and happy times to come. There was something to admire about someone being able to do that. He never lost that hopeful outlook. Still, there were times one should talk and when one should not. While I didn't say anything, I felt that the current moment was not the right time for such chatter. A short time later, we left the road. We had walked the entire way to ensure silence and as much stealth as possible, and we began sneaking close to the camp. Passing through the mostly pine trees, we stayed in the cover their foliage provided until we reached the edge of the field. Our plan was to use the very tall grass and crawl as close to the camp as possible, and then light the place up with a hail of bullets. Spino had been instructed to hang back until the shooting started, and he would be able to charge in and join the battle. The battle that we hoped would decide everything. That is exactly what it did, too. We crawled on our bellies through the thick grass, steadily getting close to the Dino Ranch camp. I remember counting down the distance left as we snuck close, like a pack of raptors closing in for the kill. We snuck closer, counted down the distance between us and the camp. 50 feet. Then it was 40. Then, we're 30 feet away and still hidden within the tall grass. Some of us were closer than 20 feet when we stood up, revealing ourselves and opened fire at the unsuspecting and unprepared marauders. The first thing I did was shoot a large Utah raptor that then tumbled back into a teepee-like tent with a shriek just stopped it. The initial surprise of our attack did do its job. The dino riders briefly panicked and had nowhere to go for real cover. Many of them simply ran straight into our bullets. The initial barrage had been particularly devastating, but we quickly realized that they were taking what cover they could and hiding themselves inside the camp. If we didn't do something, they'd recuperate or slip away. So, we did something to make sure that they did not have that chance. With Spino right behind us, we charged into the camp, still shooting throughout the whole encounter as we began to hunt them down. A tense, close-quarters gunfight broke out, something that honestly looked like it belonged in some World War II movie, one that just had dinosaurs in it. At the time, I couldn't tell who was winning. I did see someone on our side who was standing to my right fall after getting hit by a bullet. I aimed and shot the rider who had shot whoever had been standing next to me. If the situation was less hectic at that moment, I'd have tried to see if I could have helped whoever it was. But the situation didn't allow it, and I had to continue on deeper into the camp. The minutes dragged on. Spino circled the camp and picked off any dino riders who were trying to run away. Though, he did tell me later he wasn't able to get all of them, and several, probably a dozen or more, did manage to escape the battle and flee into the forest. We haven't seen any signs of them since. They probably rode as far away as they could. The rest of us, meanwhile, focused on encircling around the camp as best as we could and hunting down whoever was still alive inside of it. Our plan did work. The Dino Riders were defeated by the end of the battle. Those left at that point were scattered around the camp, but were steadily hunted down and killed. We were not in the mood to take prisoners at that time. It was as the battle was winding down that I found out who it had been that I'd seen get shot next to me. It was Mark. I remember when I saw him, he was reaching towards me, extending his hand, asking for help, comfort. I ran to his side and took his hand, crouching next to him as I did so. I remember our words we exchanged vividly. They're etched into my brain as permanently as words written in stone. He'd been shot in the gut, and we both knew he wouldn't make it back to the community. No, I think he knew more than I wanted to, if I'm being honest. I supported his head as he tried to sit up, but he found he was unable to. "Thank you, Nick," he said between gasps and small spasms. "You were my friend, my good friend. Now I'm going to be with my mama." Tears fell from his eyes, and I squeezed his hand harder. It wasn't fair. He had been one of the most down-to-earth, wholesome men I'd ever known. The kind of person who deserved a long and happy life. All I could do in that moment was comfort him as he lay dying. I kept the tears from my eyes as best I could. I wanted to be strong and supportive for Mark in those last moments of his. Will you build my cabin?" he then asked me. That was enough to break my resolve, so, crying, I nodded. Damn right, you better believe I built that cabin, just like he had wanted. Thank you. I always wanted a cabin like that, he said to me. You'll get it, I assured him. Thank you, my friend, he'd replied. Those were his last words. We loaded our dead into trucks we brought out following the battle, so they could be taken home and buried. We left the bodies of the dino riders, human and dinosaur alike, where they lay. As we left the camp, the first scavengers, in this case an antagonist, were already starting to show up. I saw an allosaurus also approaching the camp the last time I looked back. Prehistoric carnivores descended upon the scene quicker than vultures descend on carrion. The next few months passed peacefully. I was at the forefront of rebuilding the community, and they grew to see me as the leader. I didn't want the job, but I took it just as quietly as I'd been elected to it. I'm still the leader today, trying my best to make my little pocket of civilization flourish in this new world turned into a crazy mix of Silurian, Permian, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, Eocene, and everything before, after, and in between. And it's not just us in Arnold's community either. We found 2 others as well. There are 4 communities of survivors doing the same thing as we are, and I bet there are others out there too. Other places where people are doing what we're doing. Just wonder if we'll ever find them. And you know, despite the conflict, we were lucky. Luckier than most people out there probably, because most people are likely still scattered all over the place and just traveling in groups from one point to the next. We're not moving place to place on the road, scavenging abandoned cars in the hopes of finding enough food to not starve. We have a home. Mark's cabin was truly something once it had been finished. I built it just like he had said he wanted it, down to the little details, making it as perfect as I possibly could. I know he would have loved it. Mark was one of those people who only come once in a lifetime. He was just the definition of a good man, a good friend. And he had been taken from all of us far too soon. Every few months, I always make sure that I go put fresh flowers on his grave, which was next to a church that we built ourselves. It seemed to be fitting to have one in the community that we'd made home. It is just one of many buildings that we've added to the community, and it will be far from the last. I've also changed since the conflict. Like everyone else I share my new home with has. Sometimes, in the time shortly after the fighting had ended, I come up to this same hill that I'm sitting on as I write this now and just sit. I'd think about the new world that had fully set in. I'd think about what I'd and everyone had been forced to do to survive. I'd also think about the future. Taking that lesson from Mark. Tomorrow wasn't an impossible goal to reach. I'd seen so much, so I knew we could make it happen. And it seems that we're well on our way of doing it too. I've also come to peace with the terrible things I had to do. That's not all that's different about me now. I have a wife now too. Arnold's wonderful daughter that I mentioned. The most beautiful, loving, maybe overprotective just a bit, woman I've ever known. And my wife and I are actually talking about having a kid. I didn't think it would ever happen. But if we do, I know that the moment I wrap my arms around them for the first time will change me in some ways I just don't understand yet. We do have kids. I'm excited to show them the world, to show them how to grow up in it. And I'm excited to build a world for them where they'll have a good future. Again, tomorrow is not an impossible goal to reach. When I found that egg years ago, just sitting unassumingly on a rotting log, I never thought that it would lead to this. Spino is the reason I'm here. I owe him my life and this new chance I've been given. It is a gift and a blessing that I will not waste. Whatever happens in the future, whatever happens tomorrow, I know one thing. I know that it is going to be good. It is going to be a new beginning in a new world taken over by the ancient past. I found what I was meant to do, and I know now who I really am. For the first time in my entire life, I know who I am and what I was looking for. I found my missing piece. This is the end of the prelude. The main plot of the book begins 11 years after this short intro story concludes. I hope you enjoyed this little glimpse and are interested in reading the full story upon its release. More narration of little side stories set within the same universe at different points of time and featuring different points of characters are planned. I'm also planning to begin streaming games soon, and I plan to talk about the details of my books and characters and who you have yet to meet there. So please stick around. One final thing to keep in mind, in these narration videos, I'm reading what is not necessarily the final draft. The text is subject to change until publication. Heck, as I was recording this one, I was making changes as I went. But thank you for listening to my own little narration of my first ever serious attempt at writing a novel. I've honestly wanted to write books since 3rd grade, and I did write one in the 3rd grade, but it's best that that one never sees the light of day again. But seriously, thank you for listening. The Spinosaurus will hopefully release in the fall of this year, and it is nothing but a passion project of mine. Again, I love writing. I love just the joy that it gives me. So please come back anytime for updates on details. Again, I plan to start streaming games later this summer because I'm going to get an actual good laptop. One that I can use a microphone with. I apologize for the audio and maybe not necessarily being the best in these because I can't hook my microphone up to this computer. That should all go away whenever I get a new one. But yeah, I hope to see you all come back for those streams. I hope to see you come back for more details, and I hope to hear what you think. So yeah, just one more time, from the bottom of my heart, thank you again.